every traumatic event is stressful, but not every stressful event is traumatic. So, you invite me on your show, and for some reason I don't show up, and you had this studio arranged. That might stress you, but it doesn't traumatize you.
Right.
It doesn't leave you with a permanent wound. So it's traumatic if it leaves you with a wound. And if that wound leaves you more constricted and more afraid and more suspicious and less comfortable with yourself, more hostile to other people, less comfortable in the world, then it's traumatic. Now, not every stressful event will have that effect, but if it does, then it's traumatic.
If it makes a wound.
If it makes a wound, that's what makes it traumatic.
Because a wound is sensitive, even if you think of a wound.
Yeah.
And if it's not healed properly,
then
it's always a problem.
Well, there's two, and there's two ways a wound can show up. One is just an open wound, and if you touch it, ow. So I have certain emotional wounds, and well into my 70s, or even I'm 80 now. Say my.
You look great.
Well, thanks. It's all the Botox.
Yeah.
And the adrenaline. No, it's. And in my 55-year-old marriage with my wife, she might say something or react in some way that touches an old wound, and all of a sudden, I'm not this 80-year-old guy. I'm this 1-year-old kid responding, because that wound is sort of, I'm not giving an excuse here.
No.
I'm just saying that that's the challenge, So in one sense, a wound is a trauma is an open wound that you touch it, ow. That's the one thing. But then the other thing that happens to wounds is they scar over. Now, scar tissue is thick, it's hard, it doesn't grow, it has no nerve ending, so it's insensitive. So we get hardened. And
wow, so you can either get extremely sensitive or very hardened.
Or both.
Or both.
Depending on, and when you talk about hardened criminals, guess what hardened them? Is that they were so wounded in childhood. Again, I'm not making excuses. I'm just telling you what the science shows.
Yeah.
And so then the question is then how do we treat each other in a society where so many of us carry wounds? So once you're hurt as a child, you tend not to trust other people. So you could be in the middle of a crowd and be laughing and interacting, but still feel quite alone emotionally. Maybe you've had that feeling.
Oh, yeah.
And that emotional isolation itself then has effects on your body and on your mind. So the people who are lonely, and the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Admiral Vivek Murthy, just issued a paper on loneliness in the United States. And loneliness, and there's an epidemic of loneliness. People are describing themselves as lonely in much higher numbers as they did 20, 40 years ago. No, loneliness is as much of a risk factor for physiological illness as smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Really?
Yeah. So loneliness is both a manifestation of trauma and a cause of tremendous stress, which then undermines physiological and mental health.
Okay, say that to me one more time.
So loneliness is both an outcome of trauma.
So it's an outcome of trauma. So something traumatic happened, it wasn't processed properly, and then now you will feel lonely.
You will feel lonely. You will isolate. Because look, if I am always being a nice guy so that you will like me, but inside I'm feeling all these emotions that I'm not sharing with you, that's pretty lonely. Even though you might like me because I'm showing you this nice side of myself.
Right, that's not really me.
That's not me. There was a study done in Australia,
wow.
or at least I used to work in palliative care. As a doctor looking after dying people. In Australia, there was a palliative care nurse who wrote a book called The Top 5 Regrets of Dying People. These were people that were dying before their time, like I used to look after, of cancer or chronic neurological illness. You know what the top regret of dying people was? that they didn't have the courage to be themselves.
Mm.
And the third top regret was that they didn't have the courage to express their emotions. They pretended to be happy when they were not, and so on. So the question for the rest of us is, do we want to wait till some terminal illness wakes us up? Or should we just confront the fact that in so many ways we're afraid to be authentic because we're so afraid of being rejected? And as children, we didn't have much choice. As adults, can we develop that freedom to be ourselves? Well, they have the ongoing wound, which is what trauma means. Now, look, let's take an extreme example.
Okay.
Let's say a child is being sexually abused. So what would their instincts tell them to do? Well, their instincts would say, fight back, or run away, or ask for help, for God's sakes. But by definition, none of those options are available to the child. So the only way they can survive is to disconnect from themselves. And that disconnection then gets wired into the nervous system, into their brain. And every time they even think of being themselves, as you just described, they get scared. Because being themselves because had they fought back, had they tried to escape, it would have even been worse for them. So that disconnection from the self was the only way they survived. Now, every time as an adult, they even think of being authentic, that fear comes up.
And it may not even come up for them like in their awake mind. It's almost like it comes up at a level where you don't even realize like that something's pulling the strings in the distance. That's what's pretty remarkable.
Well, pulling the strings is exactly the right analogy. There's a neurobiologist, neuroscientist, quite well known at Stanford University, Robert Sapolsky, who wrote a book recently called Determined, by which he means predetermined. He basically says there's no such thing as free will because we're so conditioned by our biology, our culture, and our early experiences. And he's almost right, because what he's talking about is, as you say, we're pulled by these invisible strings of our unconscious that were programmed into us even before we were born, even in our mother's wombs. And so it's just I find it personally, a lifetime's challenge to cut the strings and to actually be in the present moment as an adult person connected to myself. Did you ever read Pinocchio as a kid?
Oh yeah, Geppetto, dude.
Yeah. Now, do you remember when Pinocchio becomes a real boy and he looks at his puppet self and he says, I was so foolish when I was a puppet.
Right on.
But we're all so foolish when we're puppets. We're not stupid,
Right.
but we're unaware.
Yeah.
Well, what started me on the journey was well into adulthood. For a long time, I didn't realize I was traumatized, just like you didn't. I just was a puppet on a string in some ways, you know? And I was successful. I was a well-respected family doctor, but I was unhappy. I felt I had potential that I hadn't even nearly touched, and I had no idea how to get there. My marriage had difficulties, a lot of tension. My children were facing their challenges, and in some ways they were even afraid of me, you know, and
like afraid of your energy, afraid of like
afraid of my sudden outbursts of uncontrolled. I don't mean physical violence.
Yeah.
I mean just outbursts of rage, you know,
anger. Yeah,
you know,
I can relate to that.
And my son Daniel, who helped me write The Myth of Normal, he says in the book that the floor was never the floor. He never knew when the floor might disappear. In other words, when the loving and devoted and playful parents might all of a sudden erupt in one of their dramas, and the kids are there watching this hurricane sweep through the house, emotionally speaking. Well, that doesn't create a basis of trust or security. And it's not because we didn't love our kids.
Right.
It's not because we didn't do our best, you know. So looking at all that, at some point, I had to start asking, like you had to start asking, well, what's going on here? And that's when I started looking at what happened to me as a kid. I was very smart.
Oh yeah, I've heard you refer to yourself as smart child.
Yeah.
You like to rebel.
I was a rebel, yeah, in communist Hungary. You really had to follow the rules, and the teacher at some point sent a warning to my parents saying that he better watch it because he agitates his classmates.
Yeah, I loved getting those.
You know, I was very thoughtful. I wet my bed till I was 13.
Dude, I wet my bed, I think, till I was 26.
Oh, wow. Okay. And that does go back to childhood trauma, early childhood trauma.
Yeah.
When I was 8-year-old, my mother took me to a psychologist, and psychologist took my history, you know, Jewish infant born under the Nazis, or living my first year under the Nazi occupation, and all the horrors, and then a separation from my mother for 6 weeks. And he said to my mom, "Madam, if the only problem this kid has is that he wets his bed, you're very fortunate." Well, I can tell you, that's not the only problem that I had. So on the one hand, I was highly functioning. But on the other hand, I had all this unseen stuff that erupted later on. Now, it makes total sense, because what happens is, like when you said earlier you were fine, the heck you were fine. You thought you were fine.
Right.
And that's because we pushed down all the rage that we never expressed as kids. We pushed on the pain. We pushed on the isolation. We pretend. And we can function in the world in ways that the world can even respect and reward. We're talking here in Hollywood. Look at all the figures here that were great successes, idols to millions, and they had these miserable inner lives. I mean, you can list 100 of them.
Yeah.
You know, which is why people get into unhealthy relationships, because where did we most want love when we were kids? When we most wanted to be seen? By whom? By the people that couldn't do it. Therefore, we will repeatedly look for people who can't see us and hoping that this time they will.
They will.
You know, and unfortunately, it really gets in the way of male-female relationships.
Oh, yeah.
Because a lot of us, I mean, myself included, in my relationship with my spouse, in some ways, I just wanted to be mothered, you know, not just loved as an adult, but actually mothered. On the one hand. On the other hand, I would resent it, you know, because I don't want to be controlled.
Right.
You know, so it puts the woman into an impossible situation.
Yeah.
You know, but so there's a deep longing.
Yeah.
I totally understand that.
And
Yeah.
then you try to get someone else to fill it, and they don't even know what to do. And for years, I didn't even know I was trying to get somebody to fill it. It just nothing. I couldn't figure it out.
There was that emptiness.
Oh, it was wild, man. And my life was still okay, but just right below the surface level of my life, it was a precarious foundation.
I totally understand. I found out about ayahuasca after my book on addiction got published in 2009. It's called In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, and it's about how addiction is not a genetic disease, it's a response to trauma as it affects the brain and the psyche. But after I published that book, I go on book tour, and people got asking me, what do you know about addiction and its healing with ayahuasca? I know nothing about it. Next visit, next stop. What do you know about it? I said, leave me alone already. I mean, you just spent 3 years writing the book, and you're asking me about the one thing I don't know anything about. And then finally somebody said, you know, you could experience this up here in Vancouver, because there's a Peruvian shaman who came up there. So I did the ayahuasca, and I experienced pure love for the first time in my life. There's a little baby in the tent whose father had done a plant, and the mother was there with the baby, and the baby started cooing and oohing and awing, and these tears of love just flowed down my face.
Wow.
And my heart just opened. And I realized how closed my heart had been because it was so bruised so early that I closed it down. Not that I deliberately closed it down, but
Right.
as a way of protecting it. And that right
must be
away said, okay,
monumental.
I can work with this to help people who are addicted. Now, I'm not here to advocate its use. It's not for everybody. It's certainly not a panacea. Psychedelics is a whole other conversation.
Yeah, same. I'm not saying anybody should.
They have their place. They're not the answer, and
Yeah.
they're certainly not for everybody. But in the right context, with the right guidance, the right preparation, they can really help people open up to parts of themselves that they weren't even aware that they were there.